Hello there, my name's Card. I'm a long-time progressive organiser and community activist. And here on my YouTube page, I like to make simple little videos talking about topics which interest me. Today, I just wanted to briefly expand on a few ideas you might already be familiar with, but I wanted to touch on something that I haven't seen anyone else ever explore specifically. A little bit of background. You may have heard before that throughout the 20th century, all over the West, but in the USA in particular, a lot of conservative politicians and pundits frequently made criminalizing the sale and use of drugs a big part of their legislative and cultural agenda. There's a lot of reasons they did this. A big part of it, again, especially in the US, was that they wanted essentially more people getting locked up in service of the for-profit prison industry. And often, in order to push the narrative that this was a good thing, conservative lawmakers wouldn't just come right out and say that they want to take away people's rights. They would frame drug consumption as this really inherently sleazy and degenerate vice. To that end, from the post-war period through to the modern day, a lot of drugs would be the subject of propaganda materials made by government-backed outlets and conservative media institutions. And the go-to move a lot of this sort of propaganda would do in order to stigmatize drugs would be to associate them with racial minority groups, even when, in reality, historically drug users have always been fairly evenly distributed among racial demographics, pretty much across all of the developed world. Who's likely to get arrested and punished for a drug-related crime is a different story entirely. And again, a lot of that disproportionate arrest and conviction rate is all downstream of this effort by reactionary policymakers to tie drug use to racial minority groups. Most notably, in the US in the 60s and 70s, Richard Nixon did a lot to increase the penalties for using and distributing cannabis and heroin, and his administration's propaganda arm did as much as they could to associate each with black people in particular. In his time as both president and vice president, George H.W. Bush spearheaded clandestine efforts to introduce crack cocaine to more and more urban black neighborhoods, and then worked to toughen up sentencing laws for it specifically. And even decades before the neoliberal turn in the 70s, the whole reason Americans used the term marijuana instead of cannabis is because of early 20th century efforts by politicians and propagandists to make the stuff sound especially bad to white American ears by referring to it with the common Mexican-Spanish word for the drug and associating it with Hispanic immigrants. Often, I find that my fellow progressives already know generally about the examples I just mentioned. But there's one other example I wanted to bring up and then use to make a point that I find most people haven't heard before. The Ronald Reagan era definitely pushed a lot of this anti-drug propaganda too. The most visible aspect of it at the time was when First Lady Nancy Reagan toured the US school system telling kids to just say no, in an effort to frame addiction as a moral failing. But there was also a whole bunch of television advertising and print advertising, and they even started putting PSA splash screens on arcade game cabinets at the time too. A whole barrage of messaging designed to reach everyone in an effort to stigmatize the use of controlled substances. And the Reagan administration definitely pulled no punches when it came to trying to make drug users look like the scum of the earth. And interestingly enough, this period is basically where we get the stereotype of the white trash methamphetamine user from. Just like Nixon had done with pot and black people in his war on drugs, someone in the Reagan White House evidently signed off on a lot of messaging that codified a particular image of a meth user into the public imagination and pop culture. I imagine that you'll already basically know what I mean. Dumb, really rural, white, lives in a rundown shack, and definitely missing most or all of their teeth. That stereotype was essentially invented by the Reagan administration. The main way they pushed this image of a meth user out into the world was a big anti-drugs advertising campaign where they'd have mugshots of people ostensibly arrested for meth crimes plastered everywhere, and they'd highlight how trashy and toothless these people looked in order to further stigmatize drug use. And as you might have guessed already, a lot of that imagery was not all that representative of reality. First things first, methamphetamine use certainly was not and still is not limited to any one particular social demographic. But it's not like these sorts of advertising campaigns would show that. They're just going to show examples of people who seem to uphold the Reagan government line that this is what meth users look like. If you arrest literally hundreds of thousands of people a year for drug-related crimes, you can easily find at least a dozen of those arrestees who aren't all that photogenic to then make the face of your anti-drugs campaign. And that's not even getting into how many instances of propaganda like this was made either by law enforcement at the state and local level that just used a picture of whoever they wanted to and said it was a meth user, or private conservative interest groups who would literally hire actors and make them look as disheveled as possible for taking their own mock mugshots they could publish. But even in cases where you get an actual methamphetamine user who looks bad and make them the face of this month's Just Say No ads, they're still ignoring the actual reasons why, in this case poor rural whites, might look like that in favor of blaming all someone's appearance problems on drug use. If you randomly arrest someone from, say, the poorest parts of the US Deep South, regardless of what for, they might just look like they fit the stereotype you're trying to push here. You're targeting people who have been the victims of generations of systemic failure, like a lack of healthcare access and poor nutrition stemming from limited availability of healthy food choices and undereducation. Sure, if you arrest a 30-something meth user living in the Kentucky holler, his skin might be bad and he's missing a few teeth. But might just be the case if you saw his neighbor, who'd never touched the stuff once in his life, he'd have a lot of the same problems and he'd look very similar. Drug use, by and large, isn't causing the sort of awful health outcomes these sorts of people have. It's a failing of their state and federal governments that have done that. It's most obvious when you think critically about the stereotypical poor oral hygiene of meth users. You might have heard in a high school health class a passing explanation that amphetamine use leads to tooth decay or jaw grinding. But to say that causes the stereotypical no-teeth meth user look would be a bit of deception by implication. You might be able to point to a medical source that says heavy stimulant users report some dental-related issues at a rate at least marginally higher than average. But the big problem with ever reliably testing the stuff is that we can't ever do a properly large-scale controlled test where we give tens of thousands of people meth just to clinically demonstrate this. So the line you hear in anti-drug propaganda won't be easy to challenge with lab results anytime soon. But think about real-world instances where large quantities of people have been given amphetamines. Not just every restless 90s kid who got hastily prescribed Adderall or Ritalin like it was going out of fashion, but the millions, literally millions of soldiers in the Second World War, for instance, who spent their entire time in the military hopped up on a daily ration of Tanker's chocolate. That's literally just meth. And it's not like every GI came home without his teeth, is it? But conservative PSAs would have you essentially believe that one hit of meth and all your teeth just turn black and fall out. That's because what the stereotype that was pushed out into the public consciousness for decades was. But again, it's not all that representative of actual reality. It's just something to keep in mind. Quite frequently, the stereotypes reactionary propaganda instills in you might go unchecked. You might be perfectly able to watch a Nixon-era anti-cannabis PSA and point out how laughably wrong it all is, but people by and large tend not to be as familiar with the realities of quote-unquote harder drugs. Reflect on your assumptions and biases about the world and critically interrogate where you might have picked them up, is all I'm saying. If you think amphetamines alone cause all your teeth to fall out and your skin to blister, you've fallen for a Reagan administration lie, designed to make you think less of poor people and blame them for health issues they would really more likely have picked up because of systemic failings in the US healthcare system. It's just something to think about. Once again, my name's Card. If you might like to hear more from me, feel free to subscribe to this YouTube page, or just take a look at my other videos. Either way, goodbye for now, and have a lovely day.